Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. This is Blessed Man Meditations, where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and where we equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look at Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Eric Metaxas is a best-selling author. He's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal, including a pretty infamous article on the Wall Street Journal about how science increasingly makes a case for God. And there's a lot in this book, Is Atheism Dead, about how science makes a case for God. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we're looking at Chapter 6 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas, where we ask the question, how did life originate? Or, you can't get here from there. So, in the introduction to this chapter, Chapter 6, have you ever considered the stunning flora and fauna of our planet, Metaxas asks. The panoply of terrestrial life is almost too vast to imagine. There are 900,000 different species of insects alone. There are 400,000 species of plants, including the mimosa plants, that immediately fold up their leaves when they are touched. Here's a hyperlink to a mimosa plant in action. Twist the leaf and it folds up. There it goes. Strangeness. And carnivorous plants that eat flesh. Let's look at a Venus flytrap in action. And monstrous 8-foot-tall plants that bloom once every 40 years and have a fragrance that mimics the stench of rotting corpses, like the carrion flower here. Look how tall that thing is. I think that's an adult human being standing next to it. There's a plant existing only in the harsh desert of Namibia that can live 1,500 years. That's the plant. I'm not sure how scientists know that that plant lives 1,500 years, but my goodness, 1,500 years. And in California, there's a tree called the General Sherman tree. This is the General Sherman tree that sprouted from the forest floor when Aristotle was a boy. That's a picture of the General Sherman tree. It now stands, the General Sherman tree is now 275 feet tall with a trunk whose circumference is 113 feet. Wow. The variety of animals is equally astonishing. Among the birds on our planet are ostriches that stand 9 feet tall and weigh 300 pounds, as well as bee hummingbirds. That's a bee hummingbird on the right. And they weigh 2 grams, as much as a dime. Wow. I'm surprised that you can even see a bird as small as it must be to weigh as little as a dime. And just stop and think. That little bird that weighs as much as a dime weighs has organs in it that are vital for its survival. And those little organs can sustain that life in that animal that weighs as much as a dime. That's wild. The largest mammal is the blue whale, which reaches nearly 100 feet in length and weighs up to 400,000 pounds. Can we imagine a single animal tipping the scales at nearly 500,000 pounds? At the other end of the mammalian scale is the Etruscan pygmy shrew, which weighs 1.8 grams. Pretty small. As you can see, it fits in an adult hand. Maybe that's not an adult. Fits in a hand. The Etruscan pygmy shrew weighs even less than the bee hummingbird. Again, same awe moment from a moment ago. That Etruscan pygmy shrew can have organs in it that are so minuscule yet so vital and can keep the shrew and the hummingbird alive. That's just wild. The shrew averages 1.6 inches in length. The range of marine animals beggars description too, ranging from giant squids 45 feet long to marine viruses just 40 nanometers long. A nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. I believe that means it takes 1 billion nanometers to make a full meter. Wow. A few years ago, scientists discovered a translucent fish living 26,000 feet or 5 miles deep in the Mariana Trench, where it withstands water pressure amounting to the weight of 1,600 elephants, give or take. That translucent fish that lives 5 miles deep in the Mariana Trench is the Mariana snailfish, pictured below. Speaking of whom, elephants can weigh 14,000 pounds or stand 13 feet high at the shoulder. Finally, a word about speed. The fastest human beings in the world have reached 29 miles an hour for a few seconds. Here is Usain Bolt, the famous runner. So, fastest human beings in the world have reached 29 miles an hour for a few seconds. Wow. Cheetahs can run 70 miles an hour. Usain Bolt couldn't outrun a cheetah. Here's a cheetah. "100 yards, less than 6 seconds. No human that I know will be able to do that. Some birds can fly over 100 miles per hour, and peregrine falcons can dive vertically at nearly 250 miles per hour. Let's see if this works. There we go. There you go. That's the peregrine falcon. So now we're going to look at the fastest birds in the world. The peregrine falcon, according to this list, is the fastest bird in the world. You look at the bottom of that graph. So this leads to two unavoidable questions, but this dazzling juggernaut of life leads us to two supremely important questions. One gets a lot of attention, while the other gets none. The first has to do with how this indescribable variety of life came to be, and usually involves what we call quote-unquote evolution. How did we go from invisible single-celled human life to hippopotami and butterflies and, for example, an infinity of conversations, articles, books, symposia, conferences, television programs, and films have been devoted to the subject. Though there's much to talk about, we will not talk about any of it in this book, because we must talk about the second question, which is never mentioned, much less discussed. But before we tackle the second question, let's at least sum up the answer to the first one, which we can do in a single sentence. Some people believe God was involved in how all life forms came into being, that he intended to create all life, including us humans, and did, while others believe there is no God, so everything happened by accident, randomly evolving from a single cell all the way up to all the life that now exists. That's about it. But the second question is what will concern us here. So what is it? What is the second question? The second question is simply this. What happened to bring life into existence in the first place? How did the first life on Earth come into being out of non-life? Life has been around for about 4 billion years and has taken a staggering variety of forms, as we've mentioned. But how did the first life of single-celled organisms come into being from non-life? What does science have to say about that? Or has the scientific establishment been avoiding the subject for some reason such that we never seem to hear this question asked, much less answered? As we say, once upon a time there was no life on Earth, but then, suddenly, we made the infinite leap into what we call life. It was a grand leap, like Evel Knievel jumping the fountains at Caesar's Palace in Vegas, minus the broken bones. Science says that the first life was a tiny organism comprised of just one cell. But it was life, just as much as we are life. It was alive. But the components that comprised it were not life, just as much as plastic or a stone or a silver coin is not life. So exactly how did non-life make that dazzling leap into suddenly being life? How did we jump from some non-living chemicals like nitrogen, oxygen, ammonia, hydrogen, and methane, all of which obviously have zero properties of which we call life, to the astounding miracle of life itself, which is the magical ability to replicate itself and to eat and excrete and do all the things that living beings do? And again, how in the world can it be that we never seem to ask this extremely important question? Why don't we? Now we're going to look at the infamous, famous Miller Urey experiment. When we ask this question, some bright souls may vaguely recall something from their high school science books that they believe settled this question. It was on the test, remember? We're referring to the famous 1952 Miller Urey experiment, where a couple of University of Chicago scientists ran an electrical current through a glass flask containing 4 of the most basic chemicals, water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, which were assumed to be what was around on Earth before life came into being. They called it the prebiotic soup, the before-life soup, which they assumed covered the surface of our planet 4 billion years ago. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey theorized that because lightning struck the water frequently at that time in the Earth's earliest stage, the electricity probably had the effect of catalyzing the simple chemicals in that prebiotic soup into something more complex. Probably. Okay? That doesn't speak of definitely no. That speaks of guessing. So they did their experiment with an electrical current stimulating the lightning, and voila! They eventually managed to get some amino acids out of it all, and that was that. It was settled. Of course, it was not settled, far from it. It was only the first baby step that gave everyone the idea that non-life might be able to begin the process of toddling toward life. Amino acids themselves are certainly not anywhere close to life, but it was assumed that whatever else was supposed to happen after that first step would happen, and eventually things would keep combining together in the direction of life. So the amino acids were assumed to somehow magically combine into proteins, which is extremely complicated. And those proteins and other crucial components like carbohydrates were assumed to somehow combine themselves into impossibly complex organic confections known as living cells. But this was a little bit like saying that because you had once glimpsed a baseball in an open magazine across the garage, you could probably pitch a perfect game in the World Series. It's not possible. Not possible. In fact, what the scientists were saying was a much greater stretch than even that. But from 1952 onward, that was the general idea. Those 4 simple chemicals were believed to have existed on early Earth, and so, over the eons of time, with a little bit of a nudge from electricity via lightning, the 4 chemicals combined to create several amino acids, and the infinitely complicated remainder of the process was just assumed to have happened. And it was also assumed that we would be able to recreate the many intervening steps in the lab eventually, just as Miller and Urey had created the amino acids. Just because they made the amino acids, somebody would come along and be able to create everything else, and suddenly we could, from materialistic processes, be able to explain how life began. So the question of life's origin seemed effectively to be settled based on this one experiment by Miller and Urey, which is why we never hear about it anymore. The Miller-Urey experiment led us to believe that science had essentially answered this question. And perhaps, because most of us are too embarrassed to admit that we don't remember much about the Miller-Urey experiment, we join the quietly assuming throngs and never bringing it up and going on assuming right along with everyone else. It's interesting and sometimes embarrassing to observe how consensus forms. The Miller-Urey experiment was such a loudly broadcast triumph for science that no one seemed to feel the need to follow up to see what happened afterward. And the fact is that almost nothing happened despite heroic efforts from the scientists. The fact is that we never really got much past Miller-Urey and the amino acids. Yet, we've been pushing this theoretical Rube Goldberg concept forward nonetheless as though we were making progress. So when it comes to this question of how life came into being, the scientific community has been skating onto increasingly thin ice. So yes, scientists have been trying to show what happened after the amino acids, but in 70 years they've failed to move the ball forward. The scientific establishment isn't anxious to admit failure. After all, they've been out on this limb for such a long time now that it would be tremendously embarrassing to crawl back. To admit, after all these years, that Miller-Urey really didn't accomplish as much as they had hoped that it would, because not much progress has been made. So they have essentially said nothing much, hoping that someone eventually would be able to demonstrate something. But it's a fact that we're hardly any further along than we were in 1952. That's more than 70 years now. In some ways, we're actually further back than we were back then. The problem is that 7 decades of trying with no results and is such a disaster that no one wants to talk about it. Worse yet, the ongoing failures undermine the perceived importance of the 1952 experiment. So who will be the one to finally address this problem head on? Who will make the big depressing announcement? Who will say that all the money spent over 70 years did not do what everyone assumed it would? Who will say that perhaps it's time to admit we've been barking up the wrong tree? As it happens, there's one scientist who will say these things and who's begun saying them. We'll talk about him in the near future. But first, let's look at the bigger picture. This is embarrassing. The Miller-Urey experiment happened during the Truman administration, 5 years before the Soviets launched Sputnik. In the now impossibly distant post-World War II environment, it made huge international news and was victoriously hailed as scientific proof that life should be shown to arise out of non-life randomly, and without God, although that wasn't very often brought up at the time since it was less culturally acceptable. But scientists did not miss that point, and atheist scientists were much less quiet about that aspect of it. But one thing that has happened since then is that some people have come to see that those initially giddy assumptions were so premature so as to be irresponsible and wrong. Even the Miller-Urey experiment was fundamentally flawed. For one thing, the prebiotic soup where life was thought to first come into existence was probably not much at all like what Miller and Urey assumed. We all know that the conditions on the planet were wild and far from the carefully controlled laboratory conditions of that experiment as anyone could imagine. Notice, ironically, that there's a lot of intelligence going on in the laboratory to try to make these elements turn into something. So do you catch the irony with that? But why quibble? Everyone figured that the larger point was made, and that given enough time, something like what Miller-Urey showed had happened, and the stuff after the experiment certainly had happened. The main point was that the experiment implied randomness over time could do anything. God was not necessary for life. Life could arise out of non-life by natural processes. The scientific establishment already believed they understood what happened after the first life came into existence. Darwin's 1859 theory told us that natural selection would take care of the rest. Once you had the simplest life, it was only a matter of time before it evolved ever upward and ever outward into everything that now exists. So yes, that super simple single-celled organism would eventually split into 2 cells, which would split into 4, and in a couple billion years you'd have fish leaping, and eventually some of them would crawl out of the water. And the next thing you know, you'd have dinosaurs, and then no dinosaurs, and then all kinds of mammals, and then a variety of ape-like creatures, some of which got smart enough to read and write books discussing this very subject. So for all these years, we've continued to behave as though the fundamental problem was solved and that all that remained was working out the rest of the details, except that we didn't. Despite the billions of dollars in research money spent on this in the years that have passed since 1952, the more disturbing and unavoidable problem has become, isn't it time we stopped, took a breath, and sorted all this out? Or do we think that perhaps no one will be rude enough to circle back and ask us this dreaded and unpleasant question? If you're familiar with the TV detective Columbo, played by the genius Peter Falk, you must imagine him leaving the room as though he is through questioning his people in it. As though, that's probably supposed to be, Falk is leaving the room as though Falk is done questioning the people that are in the room. They breathe a sigh of relief, but then Falk suddenly reappears, eventually, having just thought of something. "I'm sorry," Peter Falk says, "to bother you again, but I'm afraid there's just one thing I don't have straight." Of course, this is Metaxas pretending to be pretending to be Columbo, and adapting Columbo to this topic. So this is Columbo. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but I'm afraid there's just one thing I still don't have straight." This is when you know it's going to be good if you've ever watched Columbo. One can't help imagine how Columbo would proceed. Columbo would say, "Am I right to assume that you never really explained how life itself came into being? Because here we've just been assuming that we knew enough to know how it happened. And then we were off to the races talking about evolution in the whole 9 yards. But what about before that? Because ever since that Miller Urey thing, you'd think we would have just gotten someplace a little further down the line. I mean, that was a hell of a beginning, but we've been taking whacks at this thing for 70 years. Or did we figure this out and I just missed it? Because I can be very forgetful. Just yesterday, my wife asked me to get a couple of cans of, chili con carne. And what do you think? Exactly. And what do you think? Exactly. I forgot all about it. So what the hell, we went out for Chinese. But back to this abiogenesis issue. Is it really true that we don't know how we got from... Is it really true that we don't know how we got from there to there? The first there being an amino acid and the second there being a single-celled creature with a nucleus and membranes that somehow ingeniously determine what can go in and out of organelles. Now that's a piece of work in organelle. But if I'm not mistaken, there are a hell of a lot of steps between an amino acid and a cell, and I really wouldn't want to take anything for granted. End quote by the pretend Columbo. So yes, it's long past time for us to stop churning forward and take stock. What can we say now, 70 years after that intoxicatingly hopeful experiment? In The Mystery of Life's Origin, Rice University's James Tour lays out the problem as clearly and patiently as he can so that anyone in the world of chemistry can understand it. Tour is the world's premier nanoscientist and likely knows as much about the art of creating molecules as anyone. And he rather bravely is willing to say that the emperor has no clothes. He flatly states that what Miller and Urey suggested in 1952 didn't solve anything. In fact, he says it's far worse than that. It's not just that we haven't moved the ball forward since 1952, but in the 7 decades since, we have not only not drawn closer to understanding what happened, but we have certainly moved much further away. The more we've learned about this subject, the more we've actually been able to see that what looked so easy and so tantalizingly close in 1952 is in fact far beyond anything we ever dreamt. It's as if we're aiming at a target in 1952, assuming we would, over time, get better at aiming. But as we've been focused on aiming, the target has been moving further and further away. By now, it's on the other side of the universe, and the idea of hitting it is simply no longer conceivable, even to the most dedicated marksman. What we've learned in these 7 decades is that what we've been trying to do is almost certainly much harder than we originally thought. We thought we would be able to discover how life originated. But it's harder than we thought to discover that. But who wants to talk about this? How can we admit defeat when we've crowed so loudly about having a solution in 1952? Like the evolutionists, atheists do. The news of Miller and Urey's experiment was earth-shaking and albeit premature. But at the time, it was as though we had done what Dr. Frankenstein had done in Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, as though we'd discovered the very secret of life itself. We had, through science, built a tower reaching into the very heavens, and in so doing, we'd killed any reason to require a deity. We could get there without any help from a deity. James Tour explains that two problems in particular have become intractable since the Miller-Urey experiment. One is that the single-celled organism, the earliest and simple form of life, is now known to be inconceivably more complex than we thought in 1952. The second is that the one thing we thought made the idea of life's emerging via random processes a slam dunk, the one thing that we thought made the idea of life's emerging via random processes a slam dunk, namely lots and lots of time, give anything lots and lots of time and it's bound to happen. This is something we now know to be the enemy. Time is actually the enemy, not the friend of the origin of life, because organic molecules degrade rapidly, often under the same conditions in which they were formed. Some of them, like RNA, degrade in hours at room temperature and need to be stored at minus 80 Celsius in carefully balanced buffers and metal-chelating agents just to last for months. Let's look at the first problem first. So that is the end of Chapter 6 in Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Next time we will hit Chapter 7, where we discover that life is far more complex than we thought. We're alluding to that here at the end of Chapter 6. So please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching today, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.